us tonight for One Book, One Community. We face the unique challenge of not being able to gather in person, but with technology, we've still managed to come together virtually for story times, book and film discussions, and events like this. We've learned an awful lot about flexibility and thinking outside of our walls this year. This past year has shown us the importance of kindness and the power of community. This program would not be possible without support from area libraries, partnering organizations, and library users like you. This year's theme, if you haven't guessed, is kindness. And who better inspiration than Mr. Rogers? This year's book selection is I'm Proud of You, My Friendship with Fred Rogers by Tim Madigan. It is an intimate account of Rogers' human greatness and a testament to the power of friendship. Tonight, we have the honor of hearing about Fred Rogers' legacy of kindness from his friend, author Tim Madigan. In a journalism career spanning more than 3 decades, Tim has written for the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Politico, Reader's Digest, and for 30 years, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. It was a 1995 assignment for the Star-Telegram that led to Tim's interview with Fred Rogers, the icon of children's television, and an unlikely friendship. Here to tell us about that friendship is Tim Madigan. Welcome tonight, Tim.
Well, thank you very much. It's really, I'm very humbled that my book should have been your selection for the One Community event. I mean, for any author, that's an extraordinary honor. But you know, although I'm biased, I have to say that I think you made a good choice because what better topic than kindness, and what better exemplar of kindness than Fred Rogers, who seems like, because of the virtues he embodied, kindness, compassion, presence, love, it seems like his influence in our culture today is every bit as profound as it was back in the 80s and 90s when he was broadcasting his program, and perhaps more so in some respects, I think. This idea of kindness, come to think of it, it's not just a contained act. I've come to believe that any time that one human bestows a kindness on another, that person is planting a seed of some sort. Seed that, you know, none of us can really know how or when or where that's going to bear fruit. But I just think that every act of kindness is a profound act. And there was no one more prolific, I don't think, at planting those seeds of kindness than Fred Rogers. And he would be also humbled to be part of this tonight. And I'm just glad that we're getting together, albeit under these rather unusual circumstances. And I wish that I could be with you in person and share the vibe of the room and all those things. But I need community tonight. I think we all need community tonight. It's been an extraordinarily difficult time. And there's been a lot of pain across the country and across the world. And we're all hurting, I think, or so many of us are. And so, you know, the opportunity to come together and just kind of be comfortable wherever we're at. And perhaps, you know, in Fred's name, to just settle into the notion that after all the hard times we've been through, tonight we're together. Tonight things are as they should be, and that maybe we can together, with the support of one another, we can find a degree of peace Uh, as you know, Fred used to say famously that in times of trouble, uh, look for the helpers. Something his mother told him when he was a child, that when something terrible would come on the television, she would say, Freddie, in times of trouble, look for the helpers. The helpers are always there, often, not in places you can see them, but the helpers are always there. And so that has become kind of a thing in this world in the last few decades, whenever something terrible has happened. But and I was thinking about this today, though, that watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he always felt better. He always made his audiences feel as if things are going to be okay. He was speaking, his target audience, speaking to frightened and often confused 3 to 5 year olds. And the peace that would come over them as they watched his program is something that I've heard about again and again and again and again. So maybe by invoking Fred tonight, we can capture a bit of that same for ourselves. I believe, excuse me. So to begin, I have come to believe over the years, and I know I'm not the only person who feels this way, that Fred Rogers is one of the greatest human beings ever to walk the face of our planet. For reasons I think you'll probably have a bit more of an understanding of at the end of my talk. However, in the fall of 1995, I would not have been one of those people because I didn't watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on television, or very rarely I did. Maybe I might have caught a piece of it here and there when my own kids were watching it. But to me, Fred Rogers was this guy who was parodied by Eddie Murphy on Saturday Night Live, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. I just thought he was kind of a nerdy, spoke real soft, seemed like a decent guy, but just not somebody I'd pay a lot of attention to because, my man growing up was Captain Kangaroo. There's a generational divide in America between Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers, and I definitely felt on the far side of that. I was Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers and Rocky and Bullwinkle, Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Green Jeans and all those guys. So anyway, in the fall of 1995, I'm a journalist. I was working at Fort Worth Star-Telegram in Texas, where I still live. And I was working on a story about violence on television and how it affects children. And a colleague of mine at the paper, June Naylor Harris, said, who you should interview for that story? You should interview Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers, which I thought was a terrific idea. But you just don't pick up the phone and call Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers. You got to make the necessary arrangements and talk to their people, all that stuff. Well, anyway, one day in October 1995, the phone rings at my desk and it's Captain Kangaroo. And I was just beside myself because here was this guy that I'd spent so many of my formative mornings watching. He was just, I was just, like I said, beside myself, thrilled. And he and I, Bob Keeshan and I, ended up having a nice conversation, and he was a very nice man too. Hang up. And literally a few minutes later, the phone on my desk rings again. And when I answered, there was that voice at the other end of the line which said, well, hello, Tim. This is Fred Rogers calling from Pittsburgh, as if I wouldn't have known. Probably less giddy at hearing his voice than I was when Captain Kangaroo called, but still, Fred Rogers is clearly a celebrity, and you don't get to talk to many of those people. And a couple of things I remember, we talked about his program, which he explained to me was he conceived to be as kind of an antidote to what he thought was just abysmal children's television. he felt he could do better than what was on TV. And he's very generous with his time. It seemed like we talked for an hour. And the thing I most remember about that conversation, of course, is towards the end of the conversation, and I don't really remember the context of what it is we were talking about, but towards the end of the conversation, he said to me, "Tim, do you know what the most important thing in my life is right now?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Rogers, you know, we just met. How could I possibly know that?" And he said, "Speaking with Mr. Tim Madigan on the telephone." And there's something about the way he said it where I knew that he was being absolutely genuine. You know, it wasn't his wife, it wasn't his coworkers, it wasn't his kids, it was me. And the reason for that is that I happened to be the person who was in his presence at that moment. And to me, that exchange goes to the heart of what I consider to be one of the foundational aspects of Fred's human greatness, which is to be present to people, whoever they were, however long or brief the interaction might be. It really didn't matter whether it was 5 minutes or several days or somebody met on the street. Katie Couric had one of his friends, or the guy handing out towels at his health club. When Fred was with you, he was wholly with you, without any kind of his own mental preoccupations, without any of his own agendas, without any of his own distractions. You know, he was wholly with you. So whatever it is that you wanted to share with him, he would take into himself this undistracted, completely present self. And then he would respond in ways that were compassionate, kind, loving. And to me, one of the most remarkable things about Fred was never judgment. You know, he never judged people. And you know, it's extraordinary, and that is what he, in a way, what he tried to convey on television. What he told me one time that he literally tried to look through the lens of a television camera and make eye contact with every one of the people, young people, old people, whoever they might be, make eye contact with them individually. He never referred, as you may remember, he never referred to his audience in the plural. It was always neighbor. And basically his message was in that show was that I know that it can be hard to be 3 years old or 4 years old or 5 or 63. Sometimes things happen that are confusing. Sometimes things happen that aren't fair. Sometimes the litany of things that can cause us pain is pretty endless. But his point was, for the next half hour, you know, I'm going to be here for you and for you alone. And he brought that to his program. He brought that sensibility. And I think part of the secret to his success, he brought that sensibility to his program. And as I would come to experience, he brought it to his relationships in real life. So that conversation went well enough that I was invited to Pittsburgh a few weeks later to work on a profile on Fred himself. And so I would spend 4 days with him. And so I flew to Pittsburgh and met him. Had several long interviews with him in his office. Watched him film a program. Some really extraordinary things that I observed during that, which are in the book. And it was in the first in our first conversation in his office, he had just lost one of his best friends to cancer, a person that he had grown up with and was one of the formative influences on his life. And he was talking about this person. His name was Jim Stumbaugh. He's talking about the anger he felt at cancer and how he expressed his anger through his fingers on the keys to his piano, and how he believed that children saw him as a real person with real feelings. And then he did this, which I think is a pretty instructive moment and probably the moment that our friendship began. And remember, I'm a journalist with my tape recorder running in front of me. And he had been looking out the window into this beautiful fall day, speaking even more quietly. And then he looks over at me and he says, "You're ministering to me, Tim. By listening, you minister to me." And I think that is the point. By being present, we minister to one another. Anyway, like I said, it was after a few hours of being with him, I realized that I was in the presence of someone unlike I'd ever met. And did the interviews and watched him film a program. And on Saturday morning, I felt like I had, I had what I thought was going to be our last interview. So I went back to the hotel and was going to be flying back to Texas and on Sunday afternoon. And the phone rings again in my hotel, and it's that voice again. And I said, "Tim, if you're not too busy, would you be willing to or able to come and join us for church tomorrow?" And I go, "Yeah, church with Mr. Rogers. I think I can fit you in there." So anyway, I go to this Presbyterian church and meet him. And he's an ordained minister, but his ministry was considered to be his television program. So he was just a member of this congregation. I met his pastor and his wife, and he had his 2 grandkids with him in the pew, 4th pew, on the right-hand side. I remember very specifically where we were sitting. Probably because of what happened when the minister comes to the point in the service where he asked people to share their joys and concerns. That's a familiar thing to a lot of us. And so anyway, someone talks about someone who's sick or with a new baby or a new job, and the kind of the things that we talk about at a moment like that. And the last person to speak, the reason I remember where I was sitting is I desperately wanted to turn around and look at her. She was standing in the back of the church. And she launched into a long and deranged, somewhat nonsensical and long diatribe about war. She just went on and on and on and on, and really not making much sense. And you could just sense the level of mortification rising in the sanctuary. The people are going, "Who in the world let her in?" And you could almost hear the poor minister thinking to himself, "What tactful thing can I say to get this person to sit down and be quiet?" Well, finally she did. And as the congregation kind of exhales as one, including me probably. The one exception being, of course, the guy sitting next to me in the pew, who leaned over and whispered in my ear, "That poor dear, don't you know that at some point in her life she suffered terribly because of war?" And then at the end of the service, when this woman was standing at the back of the church, clearly being ostracized, it was Fred and Fred alone who went up to her and gave her a big hug and stood for several minutes, listening to whatever it was about war that had caused her such pain, whether it made sense or not. Because to Fred Rogers, the only thing that mattered is that it made sense to her. And I like to think that, ladies and gentlemen, is what true human greatness looks like. So that day he walks me to my car and gives me a hug, tells me he's glad to be my friend. And when I get back to Texas, my wife Catherine says there's something you need to hear, and on her telephone answering machine, which is what we had in those days, I suppose, there was that voice again that said, "Well, hello, Catherine. This is Fred Rogers calling from Pittsburgh. Just wanted to thank you for sharing your husband with those of us in our neighborhood." And I was like, oh, geez, he could be such a nerd, but he could get away with it, right? Anyway, Fred Rogers says he wants to be my friend. And so I think I'll take him up on it. So I began to send him stories that I was proud of that I'd written, and maybe a letter here and there, and I corresponded with him much more often than I had with pretty much anyone else. And every time I sent him something, I had his reply within a few days, as if he had nothing better to do than answer my mail. But after several months of this relatively superficial correspondence, I realized that I needed to write him a different kind of letter. On the wall of his office in Pittsburgh, there's a quote from the book The Little Prince, which in English is translated to, it's a book in French, but in English it's translated to something to the effect of, what is essential is invisible to the eye. And Fred went through life from the time he was a boy, going through life trying to find out about another person's, what he called essential invisibles. What is it about another person that doesn't meet the eye that is so essential? And he had a very kind of gentle but persistent way of trying to elicit that from you when you were in friendship with him. One of his favorite sayings was, anything mentionable is manageable. He spoke in these unequivocal terms. Anything mentionable is manageable. He liked to quote his friend, the Catholic writer Henry Nouwen, who said, what is most personal is most universal. Now think about that. What is it that's most personal? Is it the things we're proud of? Is it our glories, or is it our shame? Is it our insecurity? Is it our anger? Is it our sadness? Is it our depression and loneliness? Human beings seem loath or go to great lengths to conceal those things from one another for fear that if people really knew what our insides look like, then they really wouldn't like us. And we suffer from this misapprehension that we are the only ones who feel this way, when in fact, Fred and Henry were saying, those are precisely the things that we have most in common with other people. The frailties, the furies, the doubts. And Fred was one of those people that I think was ahead of his time and saying, having feelings is not a character defect. Having feelings is just being human. Having these messy feelings is just being human. It's just part of who we are. And you don't need to hide them. There are always people in our lives for whom we can trust and say, this is who I really am and this is what I really feel. So anyway, after about 6 months of this correspondence, I wrote him a very different kind of letter. And I said something to the effect of, "Dear Fred, I'm really glad to be your friend, but if we're going to be friends, I think you'd be the first to agree that you need to know the truth of my life." And so here it is. And so I told him about uh, what I see now, what I recognize now as years of life-threatening depression and pathologically low self-esteem, struggles in my marriage. It was just really a difficult time. You know, ironically, at that time, I was winning a whole bunch of journalism awards. And from a distance, you know, you would think this guy is probably pretty happy. And on the inside, the truth was that I was dying. It just speaks to this, the lengths to which we will go to kind of conceal the truth of our insides from one another. And in this letter, I said to him, "Fred, at the heart of all this is this haunting notion that all of my life, I've been trying to get my father to be proud of me. And no matter what I've done, get good grades, be a good athlete, win journalism awards, I've never felt in my heart like I've succeeded." So in this letter, I said to him, "I have a question for you. You know, would you be proud of me?" And for whatever reason, I folded the letter up, put it in an envelope, licked the stamp, and mailed it away. And I'm still amazed that I did that. An act of desperation or inspiration. Had I not, we would not be sitting here together tonight. July 1st, 1996 came as reply. The answer to your question, Tim, is yes. In capital letters and exclamation points, a resounding yes. I am proud of you. I will be proud of you. I have been proud of you since first we met. And he said, "I'm deeply touched that you would care to share so much of yourself with me and look forward to hearing all that you care to share in the future." Another time he told me, "Your trust confirms my trustworthiness." And again, going back to what we talked about a minute ago, is that when we can take off our masks and allow another person to see us for who we really are, we're, in addition to many other things, we're paying that other person the highest compliment, which is to say, you know, I trust you. He said, "Your place in this life is unique, absolutely unique. You know how special you really are." And he also said, "There's nothing," again, an unequivocal word, "there's nothing you can tell me that can change my yes for you. Please remember that." And frankly, I didn't believe him. There had to have been something that I could say or do, or even the great Mr. Rogers would say, "Oh, Tim, I'm going to wash my hands of you from this one." And in a year and a half later, after the IPOI letter, as it's known in my house, I thought I'd found it, because the book begins with me putting up Christmas lights at our home in Arlington, Texas. That's a suburb of Fort Worth. With a very heavy heart, because a few days before, I told my wife that I wanted a separation. And as I was putting up lights, I was thinking the mundane and terrible things you think about at a time like that, about finding an apartment and furniture and telling the kids, and can we make it through the holidays? But quite literally, the thing I was most preoccupied with that day was, how am I going to tell Fred Rogers, this man who had devoted his life to children and families, that I was getting ready to blow up my own. Anyway, when the lights were done, I went in and sat down on my computer, and the tears were streaming down my face. And I was like, "Dear Fred, I really hate to have to tell you this, but this is what's going on in my house. You know, could you," I quite literally asked him, "could you be proud of a man like that?" Mailed it, folded it up, mailed it away. A few days later, I had his reply, which said, "Dear Tim, please know that I would never forsake you. that I would never stop loving you, that I will always be proud of you. He said, those of us who care about you are privileged to share your pain. If only we lived closer, I would drive to your house and knock on your door. And when you answered, I would take you into my arms and hug you tight. I'm more convinced that the older I get that fewer and fewer people in this life can escape major suffering. And then he signed off by saying, you are my beloved brother, Tim. You are God's beloved son. And this at the moment, of course, of my greatest shame. A few weeks later, I wrote him another letter, which said, Catherine and I are not going to separate. I had gone away and done some soul searching and realized that the problems in my marriage had much more to do with me than anything. And so here we are, weathering a historic Texas snowstorm together all these years later. So I wrote him the second letter, and how do you suppose he replied? He replied something to the effect of, oh, thank God. He said, I'm so happy for you and Catherine, and so happy for your children. He said, you two have been through so much together and continue to grow in such important ways. And then he closed by saying, do you know how important it is to me to have such a trusting and trustworthy friend? I guess maybe the point of all this is, one of them anyway, is what he didn't say when I wrote him that first letter. He didn't try to problem solve. He didn't try to do this or do that. All he did was say, please know that I would never forsake you. That he was just present to me in the moment of my pain. Knowing that whatever had led to that moment in our lives, knowing that any man who was about to do what I was about to do must have been in tremendous pain. And that is all he cared about. So you kind of get the idea, right? A few weeks, and he did this with everyone. Did this on his program. He did this in his relationships. You got a version of, got to see that a bit in the movie, I think. It came out last year. But I'll close with another letter he wrote me a few weeks after the I'm proud of you letter, in which he said, Dear Tim, tell me about your dad. What was his childhood like? And I responded to him by saying, well, Fred, I don't know. I've never asked. And that inspired me to start talking to my dad and asking him about his childhood, and what I learned just broke my heart. He's the son of alcoholic parents and a very kind of barren home life. He had suffered from depression himself. Yet he went on to get married and raise a large family and be known in our little town as the most ethical and honest businessman in town, and faithful to my mother, and just decent as the day is long. And how he's able to do that without therapy, without antidepressants, and that, the more I learned about him, the more he grew in my own eyes. And one day in particular, he and I were driving through his hometown in this little town in western North Dakota where he grew up. And he was a star athlete, and he was showing me these various places, of his childhood. And I asked him, I said, "Did your parents ever come to watch you play sports?" And without missing a beat, he said twice. He said, "My mother came and watched me play basketball twice." And I knew that the way he said it, that had been sitting on his heart for decades. And it also caused me to remember that when I was a kid, my dad never missed a game. One of my favorite Fred isms is, "It's much easier to love someone when you know their story." And when I learned my father's story, because of the question Fred asked me, it changed everything. And again, this is an example of Fred's compassion did not begin and end with me. It immediately extended to my father, and immediately and intuitively extended to my father. So the book is dedicated to my dad. Like I said, he lives in my soul. I think so much of what is good in me comes from him. But he was the person that I said I never, told Fred I could never get him to be proud of me. Well, just anyway. My dad died of Alzheimer's 10 or 11 years ago. And it was obvious that's obviously a very difficult journey for any family. He and my mother were living with my sister and her family in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I would try to travel up from Texas whenever I could to visit him and them. I'm going to share a passage, kind of a closing passage from the book. It's one of my favorite passages that I've ever written, frankly. It says, "On one of my regular visits home in December of 2009, I found Dad weakened from pneumonia, his moments of lucidity more and more infrequent. On a Saturday morning, I helped get him into the shower, helped him with a bar of soap, and I don't know that there has ever been a time in my life when my heart was so full of love. Later on that same morning, I sat down close to Dad in his living room, within a few inches of his face, so that I could hear him if he spoke. Outside, huge snowflakes fell on a silent and beautiful Minnesota winter morning. Dad looked at me and his eyes moistened. 'May God bless you,' he said. Then he was gone, back into the recesses of his disease. But in that moment, in that one look, in those few words, the heavens parted for me. I felt I had received the benediction from my father that I had craved for so long. I wept that morning during the long walk to a Starbucks in St. Paul, and wept again on the walk home. I thought of Fred Rogers and my desperate letters to him in 1996. I remembered Fred's love and unconditional support for me then, but also how his compassion extended immediately to my father. With that compassion, Fred had planted yet another seed, one that had flowered on that snowy winter morning. On my next trip home a few months later, my father didn't recognize me at all. That didn't matter because I recognized him. Planting seeds. It seems like a small thing, doesn't it? To do in the face of so much suffering, planting seeds of kindness. It seems like a small thing, but I don't think it is. kindness, compassion, presence, the things that he embodied are all, I think, are all our way forward through this very, very difficult time that we've been living through. And he is with us here tonight. I'm quite convinced. And he is desperately grateful and awestruck by the fact that people would come together in his name to ponder, honor, and recommit to this idea of planting seeds of kindness in their own lives. So thank you again for being with me tonight. Thank you for being present to me and a comfort to me. And I know that it's just it's a profound thing to be in the middle of this. So God bless, and look forward to a few questions if there's any out there.
Hi, Tim. Okay, it's Julia. We have a couple questions that have come in, more than a couple, but Betsy was asking, have you ever tried to model your friendship from Fred to someone else?
Yes, I suppose, in this sense that especially with guy friends, I tend, my deepest male friendships tend to be ones similar to the ones that Fred and I had, in which we would really talk about kind of the truth of what's going on in our lives and how we really felt about stuff. But most importantly, I think, and it's always, I love giving this talk because I'm always reminded myself that how important it is to be present to another person. Fred was embodied that. Fred was presence. And I think the rest of us have to, it's an act of discipline for us to basically shut off the noise in our minds and shut off our preoccupations and our own agendas and truly listen and be present to another person. And that is what I've tried to do based on my experience with Fred more than anything.
All right. We have another one from VB. It says, when you are feeling lost, as we all do from time to time, what would you say would be the one thing that you have learned from your friendship that brings you back and grounds you?
That's really an important question because, and this sort of thing doesn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen, with one stroke of a pen and one letter that Fred wrote to me. That it was my journey, Fred called my issues the Furies, and my journey to healing from the Furies was a long and gradual one. And there are certainly days still when my insides are kind of screwed up. But one of the things I've realized is I've learned how to be a much better friend to myself. Is that when I'm feeling that pain about myself, when I'm feeling anger, shame, loneliness, depression, whatever it is, rather than judging myself for feeling those things, I have much more compassion for myself, realizing that that is just a part of my humanity that Fred helped me own. And I think one of the hardest, most challenging things we can do as human beings is learn how to be better friends to ourselves. And I think that Fred and Henry Nouwen and other writers and other mentors that I've had, have really pointed that out to me. And the suffering is still intense, but I don't make it worse by adding a layer of shame on top of it, if that makes sense. And I just kind of feel the feelings. Fred said there's no should or should not when it comes to feelings. They just are. Our ability to know their origins, or we just can't know that. So the best we can do is to feel them and to share them with other people we trust. I think he wrote a song called What do you do with the mad you feel when you feel so mad you can bite? And he would suggest to the little ones, run around the block, pound on clay. But what he didn't say is, don't be angry. That's just normal. So I guess the short answer to your question is, based on my experience with Fred and others, that I've learned how to be a much better friend to myself.
That's really nice. We have somebody that wants to know if you have any more Fred-isms. They really like, this is from Margot. She really liked the one you said earlier, the more you know someone, the more you know their story. Do you have any more that you can share?
Those are two of my favorite. Hey, I'm glad I got a chance to share the one about feelings, because I just think that's so important. There's no should or should not, when it comes to feelings. They just are. And again, I think that we live in a culture where feelings are seen as character defects. If we're angry or whatever, there must be something wrong with us, when that's just not the case. The thing about, it's much easier to love someone when you know their story. That is something that I just think is just like a lightning bolt for me. I don't know that, I'm sure that as soon as we get off the Zoom tonight, I'll think of 100 of them. But one time he said, and I'd written him another letter, and our letters back and forth, especially early on, were just me kind of pouring my heart out. And he said to me, Tim, your wounded heart is a beautiful heart. And whose heart isn't wounded in some way? He said, some people are just better than others at covering that up. And again, I think that speaks to the point that we've been talking about all night.
Yeah, I'm just in awe. Okay. Nancy Neal asks, where did Fred get his compassion, his wisdom, and his character? Did you ever talk to him about that?
Well, I think, and I was talking to a podcast with a rabbi friend of mine in Israel about Fred a couple of days ago, and I told him that Fred died when he was 73, I think, of stomach cancer. His wife just passed away at 92 or 93, and I thought that Fred would be a very old man and that he and I would have had time to have some of these discussions, but we didn't, frankly, in terms of the origins of his human greatness. I think part of it was born, but part of it was born of suffering, which I think greatness and wisdom often is. And there's a story that I've read about when he was a boy, he was chubby, shy, and musical. And, we know that kids like that are real targets for bullies. And that's what indeed happened to him one day when he was walking home from school, that he was being followed by this group of bullies who were screaming at him, Fat Freddy, we're going to get you, Fat Freddy, until he disappeared through the front door of his home. And his parents said, just ignore them and pretend like it doesn't bother you, and they'll leave you alone. Well, Fred, even as a junior high kid, knew that this wasn't right, that it was deeply hurt by that. And he had the insight and wisdom to feel that pain and again express it through the keys of his piano. And then he said, from that time on, he said, I look for other people who were poor in spirit and wanted to know about, again, what I referred to earlier as their essential invisibles. So this part of his greatness came, I think, the way it generally does, through pain.
We have a couple more questions. Do you think did Tom Hanks capture Fred as you knew him?
Well, I think about as well as I haven't seen the movie for reasons that is a whole nother thing. I've seen clips of it, and the clips I've seen, that he does it about as well as any actor could. I think that there is only one actor in Hollywood that could have played Fred Rogers and Tom Hanks was it. So I do think, yes, I think that I do think that he captured them as well as any actor could.
Um, Karen asks, if you kept the letters, where are they and do you reread them?
I know exactly where they are. I haven't reread them in a long time. I've I should get them back out, right, frankly. I mean, his letters were written always longhand in this very pinched and distinctive scrawl. I mean, the letters themselves, the handwriting itself is so careful and distinctive that there was a certain power just in that. But I should get them back out and look at them. I have, went back into the book more so in the last several months, and I'm really kind of surprised by the kind of things that went back and forth with us, including the moment when Henry Nouwen died, this person I referred to earlier, and Fred called me at my home in Texas in tears because Fred and I had talked about Henry often, and Fred said, I had to talk to someone who would understand how I felt. And as sad as that was, it was really a profound moment in our friendship because it showed to me that Fred trusted me, that our friendship was truly a reciprocal one, and that it was such an honor, as he said, your trust confirms my trustworthiness. And at that moment, I knew exactly what he was talking about.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. This one was asked in the chat. Did Fred ever discuss his feelings about Sesame Street? Was he threatened by its approach, or did he ever second guess whether he needed to move to a more cognitive approach in his programming?
We never discussed Sesame Street, but I feel quite confident saying he never considered a different approach. Because I think he knew that what he was doing was working. And what he, I think that whether, I don't know, it would be interesting to know what he thought about Sesame Street, but I know that he was not a fan of a lot of other children's programming. So anyway, that's the best answer I can give. But the program that he did, and his final program in 2000 is very similar to the one he did his first one in 1968 because he knew that it worked.
Okay, we have another question, and this I feel like this goes along with what a lot of people have written in the chat to us. So it says, your book, your own story required such vulnerability and strength to tell, and it helped so many people, the person who asked this as well. And several people in the chat have also said that as well. So they said thank you, but they wanted to know, what was it like to talk publicly and courageously about your own struggles?
It was hard at first, but now it's not. Obviously, there are parts of the book that are very painful and very personal, and required great sacrifices from my family. And that was hard, but I think that we're all agreed that it's serving our story is serving larger purposes, and it was certainly challenging to start. But one of the things I learned is that what they were saying, that what is most personal is most universal, is right, because I was sharing these things and about my own pain, depression, etc. And I would just be inundated with people saying, I thought I was the only one. And when I give these talks, and I travel around, before the pandemic, I travel around and give these talks, I would have these interactions with people who were just kind of opened up because I opened up. And so that rather than it being difficult, it's just every time I get an opportunity to share, these types of things about my own life. It's just a very sacred and healing thing for me.
Well, Tim, I want to thank you for joining us tonight and sharing your story and sharing your vulnerability with us. I'm going to turn my video back on. So before everybody leaves, before we conclude tonight, I am going to draw.
If I could interrupt you for just a second, there's one last story that I like to conclude with, and it's that I love this story, and it's so Fred. Was told to me by another friend of his who lived in Seattle, Washington, and I guess it was told to me after Fred died. And this guy and Fred Fred had gone to visit him in Seattle, and the two of them were standing in line at a supermarket, waiting to pay for whatever it was they were going to buy. I don't know what it is. So they get to it's their opportunity to pay for their stuff, and the checker is a young man. And he looks up and he says, you look a lot like Fred Rogers. And Fred says, well, I am Fred Rogers. And this guy goes, oh my God, this is my wife loves you. She's going to completely freak out. She's never going to believe that I saw you. Oh my God. So Fred, and we're expecting our first baby, et cetera, et cetera. And so Fred says, well, do you have your phone? And so sure enough, this guy pulled out his phone and calls his wife and says, you're never going to believe who I'm standing here with. And he hands the phone to Fred, and Fred said, well, hello, I heard you're with child, and et cetera, and so there this couple is just beside themselves. And anyway, when Fred hangs up, he says to this clerk, he said, do you have a piece of paper? And the guy said, well, sure. And he hands it. And so Fred takes a piece of paper, or he says to this guy, write down your address. And when I get back to Pittsburgh, I'll send something to you and the baby. And so this guy writes down his address, and Fred takes it and carefully folds it into this little origami and opens up his wallet. And this guy that Fred's friend says, inside his wallet, there's about 50 other pieces of folded up paper. And this guy, Ron, said, and I would agree that every one of those people got something from Pittsburgh when Fred got back. That's just kind of the way he was. So anyway, I love that story. It's so Fred. Anyway, again, thank you. So I hope you win a book.
Thanks, Tim, so much. I really enjoyed this. So I think everybody else did, based on what the comments are that we've had. List as well. This event, it has been recorded and we posted it on our Facebook page. We will be posting it on our YouTube page very soon. So if you registered, if you're here tonight, you're going to get a link so that you can rewatch it if you'd like. There are more events to come this month, so if you, and more things to do. So if you go to www.starklibrary.org/bekind, you can find the other things going on in the community and in the county. So again, Tim, I just want to thank you so much for being a part of our One Book, One Community programming. I know it touched a lot of us, and the book meant a lot to us as well. And it's Random Act of Kindness Day. What better day to have you join us than Random Act of Kindness Day? So
totally.
Thank you everybody so much for being a part of this and joining us. And until next time, we will see everybody later. Thank you.